Hello and welcome to the Nauru Fastcast with your hosts, Dave and Josh Masson.
Pull up a chair and listen to us discussing fasting and health-related topics. So, welcome to episode 7 of the Fastcast.
So how have you been? How's things? How's your week been?
Yeah, it's been good. Been trying to have some time off this week, which has been difficult. But no, it's been good. Yeah, it's been nice actually, because when I'm in London for part of the week, I don't get to do. I do cold showers instead of cold plunges. Yeah, because my plunges here down in Devon. So it's been nice doing that every morning. So that's been really good, and that's actually going to be the topic for today. So
nice.
this is kind of fed in quite nicely.
Oh, nice.
How about you? How's your week been?
Yeah. First week back after a holiday. After our safari tent experience, which was great. But yeah, no, it's always getting back to work after you've had a week off. I mean, it's boo-hoo, but it's the second week I've had off this year, so it feels a bit like it's almost like you're more used to going along at a certain level, and then when you stop, you're like, oh right, well that's what it feels like not doing anything. You know what I mean? Like,
but I think it is important to get away. And I learned that from this week. I learned it last year stupidly, but I'm kind of repeating the same mistakes this year. That kind of definition of insanity, right? But getting away out of your environment, which kind of alleviates the triggers and the other kind of nuance that slips into your routine. And I was saying to you earlier, things like if you don't get away out of that environment, you still have the same routine. Like you get up at the same time in the morning. You still go to the gym at the same time. You go and clean the house. You do the things that you would normally do during your working week, and so therefore there's the disparity between your time off and the time that you're working that doesn't necessarily. I remember last year I went away for just a weekend with my wife. It was just Friday evening to Sunday, and I felt more rejuvenated after that weekend away than I did after having a week at home. So it is really, it's that quality over quantity. Just what are you getting out, and removing yourself from the environmental triggers that surround you and how powerful they are.
It's so, and I think that's it's ironically a little bit what I want to talk about today, but it's ironic that you were just saying this, that when you're at home and you have time off, the difference in that when you go away from your home, because those normal pre-programmed behaviours of, like I said, you come down and you're like, oh, there's dishes out, I'm on holiday, I still got to get washed, and then you just go, I'm just going to deal with it. And it's just those like triggers that normally you'd go down, you'd be like, oh, got to clean this up, and you just go and do it. But when you're on holiday, part of you just goes, don't do that.
Well, there's this kind of constant reluctantness to want to do things that you would normally wouldn't associate with doing when it's time off, but you have to do them, right? And so it's a funny thing. It's a weird kind of balance to have. I saw a really great post today, which was we used to use the internet to escape the real world, and now we use the real world to escape the internet. And I kind of feel there's a real sense of that, which it must be nice to have gone out and for you last week to have gone to the safari camp. Although you are like a child, you still write on your hand. What have you written on your hand?
I know.
I think every time I see you, I have something written on your hand.
Print and then blood pressure. I know, right? People are like, you've got paper, phones. I mean, there's so many things, and I'm like, I know, but if it's staring me in the face, and I remember. So, why don't you? What have you got for us today then?
Yeah, so for me today, I want to talk about something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is, touching on a subject of it. It's something that's such a big topic, which is cold exposure. You could do a whole podcast on your own, just talking about it. But it's something I love. I've done it for, I think I started doing it in 2018.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I went on this course with this business mentorship course. Well, I didn't even know it was that. I got kind of roped into it. My colleague my business partner said, he was like, oh, I've got this, I signed up for this marketing course for a weekend. And then he was then ill. So he was like, can you go to it? So it was like this 3-day thing. And I didn't even know he just said it was a marketing course. Went there and it wasn't that. It was this like whole immersive, business mentorship, Tony Robbins vibe thing. Anyway, it was great. But I met a guy there who had been reading Tim Ferriss's book called The Tools of Titans. And he was talking in there about this guy, Wim Hof, and And he was talking about him there called the Iceman. I was like, guy sounds crazy. Like, this is really interesting though. And then that's what started my journey into looking into Wim Hof, doing the breathing and then doing the cold exposure. So that was it back in 2018. So for about 5 years now, on and off, I've been doing cold showers pretty much every day for those 5 years, give or take, and the breathing more haphazardly. I use it more therapeutic. I'm going to do that as another talk. I think it's a whole subject in itself, but I use that more if I'm starting to feel unwell. I'll use that very prescriptively to kind of raise my adrenaline, boost my immune system, but topic for another day. So the other side of it is the cold exposure. And so I've been doing that for a while, and I've experimented with everything. And every morning now I get up and I call it a cold plunge. I like to distinguish. I think there's cold plunges and there's ice baths. Because I think there's the ice baths, the ones that people who there's a pump and regulates the temperature of it, and it keeps it below a certain area. I mean, if you look at people in America, they've got the ones, and I think even Joe Wicks, where it gets so cold that sheets of ice like break off from the bottom and float to the top. Like for me, that's an ice bath. I've got a glorified puddle in the back garden, do you know what I mean, type thing. Mine's like ambient, so I think I get in, it's like 20 degrees every day because it's just whatever it is outside. So I'm reluctant to say I do ice baths every day because I think that there's some true heroes out there who do. I mean, in the winter months, I am cracking the ice to get in, but I'm not doing that in the summer. So I do a cold plunge every day. So, but I've found absolutely profound benefits from doing it. And when you look at the research, which is coming out more and more now, it starts to support that. So what I want to do is touch on a little bit of the physiology of that today, and then just a few tips and tricks and things that people can take away. So the main thing from a physiological point of view, which I think is really fascinating, and it comes back to something you touched on in an Instagram video before, which is brown fat. Okay, so as we distinguished in your video, there's kind of white, brown, and beige. But for the top point of what I want to talk about, we're just going to distinguish between white and brown. So white fat is kind of very insulative. It helps keep you warm. And it helps to it's a storage of energy. And if we get too much white fat, we then start to lead to things like obesity, right? Brown fat is more of a metabolic fat that helps us to burn energy and burn glucose and fat. And it's very good. It's one of the key things for survival, evolutionary survival, in terms of our temperature regulation. So the way I like to think about it is, if you imagine your home, white fat is like the insulation you put in the walls. Right. So you store it in there, and if you really wanted to, and you kept just putting in more and more white fat, you could make your house pretty warm, right? But ultimately, you've either got to build inwards, which you're not going to do because you're not going to encroach on your space. So imagine you've got a detached house, right? If you just kept on going like, right, I'm just going to keep putting in this insulation, your house is going to expand outwards, right? Just full of insulation. For me, brown fat is a little bit more like the wood burner in the corner. Right? It also helps to keep you warm, but you've got to generate heat from it. So you have to put energy into it. You have to burn stuff, and that will keep you warm as well. So you have the white insulative fat that's in the walls, and then you've got the fire and the furnace that you can put up. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
in terms of works for me and my brain. So it's really, really interesting. And so how does that apply to us when it comes to cold? Well, cold exposure actually really helps us to stimulate those levels of brown fat and actually create more of them. It's actually quite a thin layer. Brown fat sits around the organs, keeps it warm. But it's fascinating. And so just to distinguish between cold, and we actually, a lot of time it's noted in the literature that's deliberate cold exposure, which I think is really important. So just because there's a degree of safety when we think about it, like you're deliberately exposing yourself to the cold. What if we quantify that, what that can be from anything from going out for a walk in shorts and t-shirt in the winter to actively getting into a body of water that's at a certain temperature. And what it is actually, what they define it as in a lot of times in the research in terms of the benefit is something that's cold enough to be uncomfortable, right? So when you get into it, either it induces a kind of breathlessness to it, whether it generates a spark of panic or discomfort. But that kind of feeling that you get is the sign and the trigger to know that it's a good enough stimulus. If you just get into a cold plunge and you go, oh, this isn't too bad, it's not cold enough, right?
Get out.
Equally, if you're going for a walk in shorts and t-shirt and you're not kind of shivering, you're not feeling that cold, you're not getting the goosebumps or that kind of thing, it's also not cold enough outside. The reason I like it is that there's not this kind of defined metric, whereas in saunas and things, 80 to 100 degrees Celsius does seem to be, in the literature, the kind of peak time to get the cardiovascular benefits from it. Whereas the cold, it's kind of like, what's your tolerance? And that brings us back to different things. So if you go into a body of water, and it's kind of bringing me, I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but if you get into a body of water when you're already cold, you will find it harder, right? If you're already warm and you get into a cold body of water, you will find it easier, okay? And there's a few different responses there. But going back to brown fat, so what happens is when you get into a cold body of water, the cold receptors in your body tell your hypothalamus, we're really cold. That then sends a signal to release noradrenaline. That then goes to your brown fat. Your brown fat then activates. And what your brown fat will do is start burning and mobilizing glucose, fat molecules. And there will also be a secondary response, which is to the muscles, which will then engage them to start shivering after a while, which is then a metabolic process. So all of this is a metabolic process of using sugar and fat as a process of heating the body up, because the body's identified that it's getting colder. And obviously we have to keep very tight regulatory temperature gauge in terms to maintain homeostasis, right? So what we're actually trying to do when we go into, there's three different things I like to think about. There's the side of brown fat, which is really, really important from us from an evolutionary perspective when it comes to thermogenesis. And if you're someone who maybe struggles with cold, you get cold really easily, it could be a multitude of factors, but one of them could be you don't have enough brown fat storages. The other thing that the literature has shown with cold plunges is that it's very, very good at releasing certain hormones that help, improve mood, cognition, alertness, things of that nature. And the final thing is our stress response, and that kind of plays off of some of those hormones. But people have noted that they are far more likely to deal with stress in a more positive way after having spent time with cold exposure for an extended period of time. So I'm going to they're the kind of areas that we're going to dive into. So we kind of touched on the fat already. Brown fat, this kind of relatively insulative but metabolic adipose tissue that's in the body. Once you get into the cold water, the adrenaline, the shivering causes the brown fat to activate. And then if you continue to shiver, you will continue to produce noradrenaline. That will continue to promote your stores of brown fat.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you've got the muscle contraction, which is the physical shivering itself. Now, this is really important because they've actually shown that as you get older, your brown fat decreases, but there's also massive links to insulin sensitivity as a result of this. So if you can, what they found is that people who increase their brown fat stores increase their insulin sensitivity. Okay, so just for clarity, we want to be sensitive to insulin. Insulin resistance is our pathway towards poor metabolic health, type 2 diabetes, things of that nature. So what they found is that actually the more you have of this stuff, the more metabolic flexibility you have, the more sensitive you are to insulin. So tick for cold plunges, brown fat, insulin sensitivity, and increasing your metabolism. There was a study that looked at 49 participants, male and female, and they did it was something around a 3-degree cold plunge for 2 minutes once a day, and then cold showers every day from that point since, which were equally two minutes in the cold shower. And after 8 weeks of only doing that, nothing else changing about the lifestyle, there was a measurable difference in waist circumference and body fat.
Wow.
In the men. Now, then more research needs to go into it, but what they were showing was that just purely from a thermogenic standpoint with metabolism, there's a chance that you can just lose weight with just doing this, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And like you said, I think it's really important. I like the way that you make that distinguishing between like the the immersion in water and the showering, because they are done on different studies, aren't they? And where you were saying before that on one of the studies, we did a video on it actually, the way that when you do 3 minutes of cold water immersion, it allows you to have raised dopamine levels of 200%, which lasts for 2 hours. And going back to your point, it raises your basal metabolic rate. So that basal metabolic rate accounts for 70% of your overall calorific usage. That goes up by 350%. So back to your point, for 2 hours. Your noradrenaline goes up by 530%. Your cortisol goes down by 17%. So a bit like you were saying, it doesn't just stop once you get out the shower.
No, agreed. And also, just for context, your basal metabolic rate is the amount of calories or amount of energy you're burning at rest.
Yeah.
Which is like really important for people to understand, because this is why a lot of people, when they diet without doing something that stimulates their basal metabolic system, it is why they yo-yo, they bounce back, because they're, maybe you're very calorie restricted and things of this nature for a very long period of time. As soon as you come slightly out of that into a surplus, your body springs out of it and suddenly you start putting the weight back on. It's because your basal metabolic rate, the amount of calories you're burning at rest, hasn't risen, and therefore you put weight on very easily. So this is one of the big things with fasting. Fasting is a massive driver of increasing your basal metabolic rate. So if you compound that with cold plunge, it's only going to be beneficial. So you just touched on some of the hormone factors there, which is really, really important. So the increase in dopamine, which is our hormone of motivation. Right? We used to think it was our hormone of reward, but now we more clearly understand as what motivates us towards something. So gamblers and addicts it's the thought of doing the thing that causes the dopamine release, not the doing of it. And it's so they think about it, they get a hit of dopamine, that then motivates them to do the action. They're not rewarded for it when they're doing it. In fact, people actually find that dopamine, they don't feel great when they're actually doing it.
So true, actually.
It's the romantic ideology and the illusory effect of going, oh, I really want to do that, being motivated by dopamine to go and do it. So, but that's really important to leverage in the mornings, right? Something also really important if you've just been drinking alcohol. So a hangover, a lot of time, we did a video on this again, a lot of time a hangover is emotional hangovers, right? Which I didn't know was a thing until I hit my late 20s, 30s, is a massive tank of your dopamine, right? So when you're drinking, dopamine goes up massively. So you get huge highs of dopamine when you're drinking alcohol. The next day, massive crash. And so cold exposure, deliberate cold exposure can be a great way of stimulating dopamine after you've been drinking. Another one we talked about, like kind of adrenaline, when you get into that cold plunge, that sudden, oh my God, it's really cold, again, increases alertness. So perfect thing to be doing in the mornings. So they were kind of some of the main topics I wanted to touch on there. And the final one was about the stress response. So what they have found is that people who regularly perform deliberate cold exposure report being able to handle general stresses of life far easier. And I suspect, and that's what the researchers suspect, is that it's because of the conscious engagement of stimulatory hormones and responses, whether it's from the central nervous system, whether it's from an increase in sympathetic fight and flight response that you experience when you get to that cold exposure, or it's the feeling of the neurotransmitter adrenaline. But when you're continuously respond to that, and then you're in an environment where you experience that high, but then you control it and allow it to drop, allows you to get in better control of that. So when you experience those highs in life, your body is already becoming accustomed to them. And this is something that Wim Hof was a very big, one of the biggest drivers for him in his journey through the cold was he lost his wife to depression, she committed suicide. And then so when he ended up going out and going into the cold, he realized the longer he stayed in there, the more in control he was, the more he could control his mind, and that it was kind of his journey of controlling that side of things. So the more time he spent in the cold, the more in control he was, the more comfortable he was, the more he kind of experienced those mental reprieves. And it is, it's a change in state. If you get into a cold plunge, suddenly, you're not thinking about that thing that was worrying you before. All you're thinking about is, holy, it's cold in here. I need to get out or whatever. And the more you get in control of that, it's actually quite liberating. And I found that certainly anecdotally myself. So a few quick tips just to wrap up on cold exposure. And as I said, this is a kind of drop in the ocean of a much larger topic. Some of the interesting things that came up was, first thing was that you don't have to be a hero and go out into the cold plunge and stuff like that. You can get deliberate cold exposure, where it's wearing less clothing when you're out and about. whether it's cold showers, cold plunges, ice baths, whatever it is that you have to do. Deliberate cold exposure can come from anything environmental when it comes to cold. My second tip is that if you are starting out and you're finding that you're not quite ready for getting into cold shower, cold bath, stuff like that, the two things you can do would either be to get a bowl of water with some ice in it and submerge your face is one thing, or equally submerge your hands and feet. Okay, because of the particular types of nerve endings, that very highly innovative nerve endings, but also the different types of blood vessels that exist there for temperature regulation. It's a great way of being able to get the body acclimated to cold before you start upgrading into cold showers. And Wim Hof's a big advocate of this. If you get painful hands or feet when doing cold ice baths, he says stop doing it for 2 weeks and just do 2 minutes a day of submerging your hands and feet into cold water, and then go back to doing it. And it's just a building up of it's just a tolerance thing. So the next thing is that you don't actually have to have your hands and head in the water. So again, some people are limited because of the nerve endings. It's really painful for their hands or to put their hand under. You don't have to. Okay, you see other people doing it. You're not a wuss. You're not. It's nothing about anything else. If you don't do it, if you're going to be able to stay in it longer, stimulate that neurological response, stimulate that brown fat, get really cold. If you're able to stay in it for longer safely by having your hands and head out of the water, then just do that. There's no prerequisite. Equally, the more of your body that is submerged, the bigger the response will be. We do know this, but if having less means that you can do more at that moment and you can build up, then do it that way. And the final thing I would say is that cold showers aren't as good as being fully submerged in a body of water. You do see this in the literature, and it just does make sense. Like if you're looking for that really strong response, like shivering is a really big thing that we shouldn't be avoiding. It's a very, very necessary process, and it's very adaptive when it comes to that brown fat response. But if we can get into bodies of water for longer periods, it does have a bigger effect when it comes to the hormonal neurotransmitter response we've spoken about. But cold showers are still fun. I actually find cold showers harder, if I'm honest, because you can't be fully submerged. So if I've got my back, it's on my back, my chest is warm. So when I turn around, I'm going back into the cold plunge for the first time.
I'm the same. I'm exactly the same.
I'm reliving. It's like an emotional roller coaster. Each time you turn around or move, it's still painful. Whereas when I get in the cold plunge, once you're in, you're good. But yeah, it's oh God, I hate having cold showers. But yeah.
No, I mean, I'm the same as you. I find them so attractive, especially when you wake up and if you're you kind of do you know what? I'm really tired today. Or you wake up in a bit of a bad mood. Mm-hmm. I like it because we always talk about stacking and behaviours, and it's one of those things where you kind of do it and you get such a reward from it afterwards that you're kind of, and I don't know, you just constantly I've come out just feeling so charged after I've done them.
And that's actually a really good point. I just remembered the final piece is that try and warm up metabolically after you've done a cold exposure, not going into a cold shower, warm bath, or anything of this nature. If you're someone who cycles cold and hot, whether it's with sauna, always finish from cold, but try and warm up metabolically because of the stimulation of brown fat. So I typically will do my cold plunge in the morning, and the next thing I'll do, not immediately after, but we'll go to the gym. What I'll try and avoid is, because then after I come back from the gym, I'll then have my shower. So try and do that. That's really important. Try and get to metabolically warm up, whether it's doing some press ups, whether it's doing some movements. Wim Hof does the horse stance to warm up afterwards. But metabolically doing that, it's going to cause your body to your brown fat stores to continue to burn through the glucose, through the fat molecules to create the changes, which are really important. Just a quick note, because it was a topic that kept coming up before. There is research to show that if you do an ice bath or something of this nature, within 6 hours of strength or hypertrophy training, you will lessen the adaptive response from that training session. So you're less likely to stimulate the strength and hypertrophy changes that you have. The research shows that cold showers don't have the same stimulatory effect, which is again supports what we've just been talking about. But when you're going and doing strength hypertrophy training, you're damaging the muscle, you're creating a hormetic response, and an ice bath or cold plunge to a certain temperature will slow that adaptive response. So that was something that kept coming up. So if you can, try and make sure you prioritize the cold plunge, cold exposure before you train. Endurance, it doesn't seem to make a difference, but if it's strength and hypertrophy specifically, it will. Or 6 hours afterwards. Just want to think about. So yeah.
No, I like that, and I do. You kind of briefly touched on the ability to kind of increase the temperature of the body, and I like it because there's some research that has shown that people that are lean individuals, they have a better capacity at when they overconsume calories to raise their core body temperature up in response to it. So that's, I find it fascinating, the way that your body can switch, and a bit like with your brown fat, utilization of energy in excess, because there's a lot of energy for every pound of fat. It's 3,500 calories. So each pound of fat, and the way that the body actually stores, especially subcutaneous fat, is actually an ancestrally kind of consistent way of you want to conserve your energy if you've overeaten to a point, because in nature and in life, the leanest individuals live the shortest life versus people in the animal world, the slower the individual. Look at the tortoise and things like that, they live the longest, and the high metabolism isn't in every setting always a good thing, but it is if you're looking at it as a weight response. But it's
and also I think there's to understand that kind of lipolysis and the process of putting on fat in terms of that white store and putting the insulation in, like we don't have, unlike glucose storage in the muscles and the liver and things, like we don't have a limit for it, which is why you see people, when it comes to weight, get to the morbidly obese and the extremes when it comes to fat. They just keep putting on, because we don't have we don't tap out at a certain level where the body's like, oh, we can't put any more fat on it. It will just keep putting more and more on. And it's about understanding, because ancestrally we never would have needed to. To put a cap on it evolutionary wouldn't have made sense. Because we would have always at some point needed it, whether or not it was. And there's a great book called which we based one of our challenges on, but The Comfort Crisis. And in that he talks about the whole fact that we're too comfortable in our lives. We don't have, we're comfortable. We're in a very regulated climate. We have available food. Our exercise is very limited and things of this nature. And he talks about really pushing ourselves, whether it's, go for periods where you don't have food, which we're advocates of when it comes to fasting. He says, go and get cold, whether it's turning your thermostat down at home, whether it's going out with less clothing on, whether it's deliberate cold exposure when it comes to cold things you're doing, is that exercise hard, like push yourself, like mentally, physically push yourself. Like these are the things that we would have done that we're just not doing. And what they actually acted it as before were rites of passage and rituals that we miss these days. Fast, and we see it in religious senses. Fasting from religious sense is a ritual, right? And it's part of that they do, whether it's yearly, whatever. But it's one of those things that we miss these things in our culture these days, where we have these challenges that we put in front of ourselves, and that's why everyone's now starting to wake up to the idea of the hormetic response, right? Which is small amounts of a damaging stimulus that ended up causing the body to grow stronger as a result of it. And we are becoming complacent in our search for discomfort because of how comfortable our environments are, and not wanting to disrupt that.
It's funny because I talk with our mum and dad, you talk to them, and then you'll say to them about this new research that's come out, and they'll just go, yeah, but your granddad only ate 2 meals a day really, and he didn't snack, and they had they wouldn't have eat 24 eggs a week like you do. They would have a few eggs, and they would have them once a day, and they would do this, and they wouldn't just go and buy their lunch. They would prepare it all, and you kind of go through. And I think a lot of the 50 years ago, a lot of the way that we live in today's society is shifted so much that I think that you have to start doing things that are difficult, because it's so much harder these days, because it's just so easy not to make the difficult decision. And it's kind of a topic I'm coming today. I listened to an interesting podcast, and a patient of mine mentioned about the glucose goddess on Instagram, and she's fascinating. And she I've actually only found her out today actually, but I'm looking at some of her work, and she's wearing a glucose monitor, which I sort of wear quite regularly, a continuous glucose monitor, because it's so fascinating, because you can kind of think that you're doing something really good for your diet, and actually when you look under the hood and see actually some of your dietary things maybe aren't working with your body, or they aren't actually healthy for you. So for example, my wife came back, this is about a year ago, and I had a risotto, and I was like, oh, well, it's all made fresh from scratch. She put bone broth in it. It's all organic food. Everything was good. And it was mixed with fats and everything. And my blood sugar went up to 13.3.
Oh my goodness.
And I have never had anything in my life that's ever raised it that much. I mean, my blood sugar normally spikes out at about 8.7.
Well, that's good.
And that's it. And my continuous glucose monitor, so my curves are so small, so short, and nothing raises them up like the carbohydrate thing. And it kind of really shocked me into like going through my diet. And my dad got one, and other members of the family have used them before, because it's a really good eye opener. Because what's fascinating is 3 out of 5 people will die from an inflammation related disease. So around about 1 billion people are pre-diabetic, or being lumped into the pre-diabetic group in the world. And, you look at the Americans, population, say 330 million, and 90% of those people are metabolically unwell. So the sort of the horsemen of being metabolically unwell is diabetes, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and high cholesterol. Okay. And so you think about that, and usually what I find more and more at the baseline of all that tends to be in a problem with people's sugars, regulating them. And you see it with patients. I've been at a pharmacy for a couple of years now, and it'd be interesting. You'll see a person come in diagnosed with hypertension, and you see them come back and they're diagnosed, they're on a statin now for their cholesterol. And then you go, okay, let's wait for it. And then they come in, oh, I'm pre-diabetic. And actually, when you sort of flip that over, you look at it and you sort of feel 90% of the time, it's coming from a baseline problem with your blood sugars that are preempting it. And I find a lot of the time when you do things, it's about sort of me search, isn't it? You find that you find something out about your body, you're not performing, or you're not optimally doing something, living your life, and you go, well, let's try and make a change. And then you make a change and you tap it back, you go, oh my gosh, so actually maybe it was doing X, Y, and Z. And, this week I was, our mum gave me some dried dates. Okay. And I sort of took them away, and in the day I sort of ate them after my meal, so I ate them right at the end, but my eczema flared up. And I was like, gosh, that's really interesting. So it's dried fruit. So it really has that bolus amount of sugar has really affected my health. So it's inflamed me. And I think what's interesting was when I go back to the glucose goddess, she's got this idea that you basically don't want to have naked carbs. So having carbs on an empty stomach, not good, which is really good. And we've done a lot of posts on it before about, there's a few different ways that you can mitigate this. So one of the ways is having a form of acid. So where that comes from fermentable foods, it comes from vinegar, and it comes from lemon juice. So for example, I quite commonly, how I have every week with me, kimchi or sauerkraut. And I'd eat that first. And actually something that she brought up, which I didn't know, was that the fiber in the diet first helps to reduce down the glucose absorption even further than, so I used to do protein, fat, vegetables, then carbohydrate. So that was something that I'd learned that I didn't know before, which was quite interesting. But then the other sort of topic was about movement around after you eat. And Andrew Huberman points to this about, especially fasting, a lot of the time cultures just say, you go and walk your dinner off. And it's something that you sort of very much think, oh yeah, we could go do that. But even doing some press ups, some sit ups. And when you relate it to fasting, it helps you to actually get into your fasted state a lot quicker by doing 30 minutes of exercise. And there's one muscle in the soleus muscle in the calf, which is very good at absorbing glucose. And so doing things like 10 minutes of calf raisings, so that can be sat on the floor, just raising your calf up, or it could be, you could stand on an edge and do that, is something that will help you dispose of sugar better. And I think the reason why I brought this topic is we've spoken about these topics in the past, but this week really feeling how having a massive spike in my blood sugar caused me to have quite an inflammatory response after. And with my continuous glucose monitor, I know I'm incredibly I'm very glucose sensitive. So I'm very good at doing that. And the issue is that when we kind of look at the actual, not so much the psychological, but the psychological effects of glucose crashing. So when you eat something that's sugary, like you said, it's the act of going and doing it actually doesn't give you any more energy, because by eating something sugary, it actually affects the metabolic process. So actually your capacity to generate energy, which is what metabolic disease is about. So being metabolically unhealthy is that you have an inability to create internal energy, because obviously we have 42,000 calories on us that we have access to and we can burn very easily, but we have lost because we're too comfortable. We constantly eat rather than allow our body to find its own energy and develop, which is why we love fasting so much, because that metabolic flexibility just really does sort of bring up something primal in you to be able to actually sustain being without food for long periods of time and without the presence of hunger. So that was I don't know, I just found it really interesting this week and when you sort of look into the ways about disposing glucose after, and there are a few things, we've just sort of gone through them there, but after you eat sugary food, this lady was describing the fact that you shouldn't really change what you eat. You should just change the order in what you eat.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, because if you can have, like, say you have a chocolate bar, but you go and have some Greek yogurt 10 minutes before and then eat the chocolate bar, then you are massively mitigating your glucose exposure. And the effects of glucose exposure, not just on your health, but on your sort of mental health, are massive. But we still come back to the same problem of not addressing that behavior and doing something that's, because as you said, the thing is these days it's like we find something, we listen to a podcast, and we find one thing. So like someone might walk away and go, I'm doing cold showers every day. And I think what my view on this is, and coming away from it, is I think it's the stacking of things that really do make a difference. And if you follow us on Instagram, you might see that we put up sometimes a daily routine in the morning. And I think it's the compounding of doing regular things. So mine is get up in the morning. I usually come down with the kids, so I have a bit of connection. I then will do usually some exercise. I have electrolytes in the morning. I then do my cold showers, and I go outside and take my shoes off and try and be outside for 10 minutes in the sun before I go. So that is like my golden routine in the morning. When I start the day like that, I feel good for the rest of the day. And there are additional things that you can do in the day, such as changing the order of when you eat. So that means predominantly trying to have more of a whole food, because if you're eating food that's all mashed up together, it's very difficult to isolate the different food groups and eat it separately. And I did that today, actually. I made sure I had my food order very consciously when I was eating, and it did, give me a more stable response to my food, and my energy throughout the day was even better. And I think doing these things, but then again, I say that, but I had prepared my food, so I had good food. I'd slept well the night before. I'd done my morning routine, and I think so. And I had my salt with me, and I had my electrolytes in the morning. I'd done my exercise. And I feel that sometimes it is about trying to create as many good habits as possible, because if you're just, it's like, if you're just trying to not stop the bad habits, but try and make them less bad, I don't think it's a real good recipe moving forward, because you have to have things in your life that you are prepared to make sacrifices on, and they're difficult. It's like, I had today for lunch, cheese, 4 boiled eggs, some kimchi, avocados, and some cucumbers, and bits of this, protein shakes and creatine and things. And then everyone in the work was having biscuits and stuff. I still want a biscuit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I don't like you, I don't want those. They taste delicious. But and the fact is, it doesn't because beforehand it used to take so much effort to not eat those things. That after a while of saying no, your body conditions into just not searching for that food. I know that I've got my food with me, and if I need something, if I'm really craving something, I've got honey with me, which I'll take. But it's about stacking those behaviors, and I think that's something that I really have been. I think it's something that's been missing through a lot of people talking. You know, when you listen to podcasts or you read things, there's always this brand new thing that's coming out. I listened to it on the news today. It said we should be doing wall sits and planks, which is going to be amazing. Which is the best form of exercise for lowering blood pressure. Okay. And I'm like, we haven't talked about metabolic disease here. You haven't talked about, low salt diets. We spent a whole episode on it last week about being just as bad for you as having high sugars and bad, and it can bring on hypertension itself. You haven't talked about the sitting, we talked about that a few weeks ago, and I think this is what I sort of find interesting to talk about, is how you can layer all these things on. And another subject that I've been sort of looking at, and I found it absolutely mind-blowing, is grounding. Again, this is a whole topic you could go into, and it is sort of very in-depth, but just by simply taking your shoes off and connecting to the ground for around about 15 minutes in a day can help to lower inflammation and also help to dispose of charge. So because we have a lot of unnatural fibers, and we walk across, the ground that has unnatural fibers like your carpets, things like this, we create about as much charge, enough charge, to charge your iPhone. So enough electrical charge in your body to charge an iPhone. And the problem is that if you look at any animal, they don't walk around with shoes on. They live outside, connected to the ground. And what's interesting is the ground is charged with electrons, and what it helps to do is the actual Earth has a diurnal presentation of electrons. So in the morning it has a higher amount, and then it dips, and then it goes up again in the evening. And this is fascinating. So actually what they're understanding is the whole looking at the sunlight in the morning, preparing our circadian rhythm. They're actually thinking, well, the sunlight, the ground, and our internal rhythm, actually all three of them might be linked for that reason. And it's amazing. They can give a voltage meter. You can stand there with a voltage meter, and you can take your shoes off, go and stand on the ground, and you see your voltage charge, and when you're holding onto it, go down. And you sort of think, well, this is a bit wishy-washy, but they can actually measure it in real terms. So they can actually measure the charge on the outside of their blood vessel. So by doing the same thing, by grounding on the ground, they can measure something called the zeta potential, which is it's how sort of negatively charged the outside of a red blood vessel is. Wow. And what they can do is they can actually measure the viscosity of your blood going down the longer that you're on the ground and grounded.
Goodness me.
And how many films do you see where, someone's really stressed, they run out of the office, and they take their feet off and they run into nature, and they just feel so much better being in nature. I mean, how often
what's that whole thing about tree hugging?
Exactly, right.
So there's actually reason for that, because, and I think there is a thing, but like that electrical charge going, because it has to be natural and all the rest of it, but like trees and stuff, like even just touching trees and stuff of that nature apparently has some of the benefits that we were talking about. But I think there's probably like more to it. So, but yeah, I think there's a connectiveness that we're missing from our environment. And I think with that, I remember when I started reading a book about grounding, it was talking about even getting, wet sand, dewy grass, like anything that's like even that's more conductive, and again, like even from a microbiome perspective, we're so sterile these days. We forget that our microbiome, we're like a donut, right? So our skin kind of wrapping around into our mouth, the mouth then going down through the whole entire digestive system, out through the anus, back around to our skin. If you were to stretch a human out and shine the light through their mouth, it would come out the other end, right? It's about understanding that this is what the biggest thing is about, understanding that even when you eat something, it's still not inside the body. It's not until it passes through the digestive system, as in through the absorbed, is it in the body. So something
Yeah.
can go in your mouth, and that same thing can end up coming out the other end of you. At no point did it go inside the body, because we are a donut. And so the point that I bring that up is that essentially we don't realize that, like, how important it is to get your feet like into on earth, and the bacteria that's around and stuff of that nature is really important.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And you do read so much. You'll hear someone saying that this level of disease state that we have had over the last sort of 50 years. They sort of say if you follow the graph, it correlates with the fact that we've had an increase in seed oils in our diet. One person would say, well, you can see the correlation between the reduction of smoking over the last 50 to 80 years, and another person would say that the correlation is between the lack of leather shoes and non-conducting footwear that we've increased will correlate with that thing. So it's amazing they've done it through pain. They've grounded people in sleep, and you get the most profound effects when you can get grounding mats that basically go onto your bed and they plug into the wall.
I've heard about these,
and they're amazing. So when they've done studies on it, the deep sleep is longer, the restorative sleep is longer. You have you wake up feeling better, you have less and disturbed sleep, and you also have a biggest reduction in inflammation, pain, blood sugar response gets down. So it's incredible the benefit of it. And they seem sort of meaningless things when you go and do it, but it's quite fascinating that people can actually have a reduction in joint pain when they go on trials where they have access to a grounding mat to sit on when they're working the computer. So socks and shoes off, sit on a grounding mat that's plugged into the wall. They will then go and stand outside. They will then go to bed on a grounding mat. And after that 8-week trial, they come away and they've come off their medication for arthritis. They've had a reduction in their antidepressant medication. And you sort of go, well, you can't ignore that. There's something in that which is fascinating, and there is a measure, the ESR, so the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and it's kind of it's a blood test that measures basically inflammation in your blood, and they can do studies on that and take that which goes down, and you're sort of like, well, this is actually science showing you that this stuff is working.
For sure. I think what's really important here as well to understand is that, I think a theme that's going to keep coming up for us, just because it's what we live with, that whole thing about like stacking things.
Yeah.
So it's not about, I think the problem is that we have in today's media is exactly the perfect example you gave earlier, which was like planks and wall sits are now the best thing for lowering blood pressure. Like, people are looking for the thing, like we said before about this, the golden bullet, the silver bullet versus the golden BBs.
Yeah.
And people are understanding that it's like, grounding isn't going to go and save your life. Like, grounding's not going to suddenly, get you off your medications necessarily, unless you do like extreme type things. Just managing expectation here. But if you do some grounding, if you go and view some sunlight, if you get some cold exposure, if you clean up your diet, if you get regular exercise, if you connect with people in your life, like, all of those things are going to compound to giving you a better sense of health, well-being, vitality. But it's not like just going out and grounding, but then going and smoking, having a bad diet, sitting at desk stressed all day, getting into arguments with your partner. Like, grounding's not going to offset that. No. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what it's always about understand, we like to promote here is in with the Fastcast and with what we do with Naru is very much like, just try compounding some of these things we're talking about, which is why we try to be diverse with the things we talk about, because we think that it's 10% versus 100% that's going to make the difference.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it really stimulated me today, because I was finishing off listening to the podcast today, and I was sort of, what made me really sort of think is, we get presented with these ultimate quick fixes, and they may be a diet, or they might be, people like do fasting, and there's part of that which is really important, but it's only going to help if you're going to commit to it and you're going to do it regularly, and it's become part of your lifestyle. Yeah. So there is no point in starting something if it's unrealistic for you.
No, agreed.
And, for example, so this is what I was thinking about today when I was listening to this lady. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, but she was saying, well, I went out to a birthday party and there was chocolate cake there. So I had Greek yogurt with my chocolate cake. And I'm like, that's amazing. But when are you ever going to bother doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe what the easiest thing to do is to just say no to the chocolate cake.
Agreed.
So I love the fact that you can have these ways of managing your blood sugar, which will then ultimately help with mood, will help with cravings, will help with all these different things. But if you don't change the one thing that's the worst thing out of that, and it's like, at every meal, moving the ratio in which you eat your food, or the order in which you eat your food is easy to do, but if there's a time you can't do it, then could you go to the bar if you're out and ask for some lemon to have in your drink before? Yes, that could be quite plausible. Or when you're out, do you just choose a starter which is more of a whole food and less carbohydrate and maybe more protein and fat, have the main and don't have the dessert?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think this is what I sort of get quite frustrated with, is it really truly is about, how good are you at making those choices, and they have to become an actual genuine change before, when they become a habit, you are conditioned and they just become easy. I used to think, how on earth am I going to fit my kids, in sometimes 45 minutes, half an hour? How am I going to fit in my workout, my getting all my electrolytes together, having a cold shower, preparing my food, spending some time with my kids, my wife, and getting out the door on time? And I'd be like, I'm never going to do that. But because it's a habit, I don't think of how I'm not going to do that. I just find the time and it works, and it just it's not a stress. Because otherwise it's a stupid habit to have. If it was going to be too stressful for me, then it's not a healthy habit.
So I think there's a few things I want to touch up on there. One thing, as we talked about before in some of our threads, which is that the quote is actually for successful people, but which is that successful people don't move faster, they get more for every step. But I think it's the same with healthy people, right? Healthy people don't move faster, they just get more for every step. So again, like you're saying about there, one person who's, let's say, we've already identified that health is a very broad spectrum, but quote unquote, someone who's unhealthy looks at something that you're doing and they're going to go, I've only got 45 minutes. And they use that as an excuse to not do the things that they could do in their morning. But then you've got someone like yourself who is going, no, actually 45 minutes is a great amount of time for me to get all this done, and you cram it in. And it's not that you're not moving faster than the other person, you're just getting more for that step in the morning, for that 45-minute step. You're just covering more ground than anyone else. And I think coming back to the second point here, which I picked up a lot when I did coaching with people, is that people would often want to solve big problems that they weren't disciplined in. So people are like, I'm not working out enough, my diet, I'm not disciplined. And it's like, okay, cool. Where else aren't you disciplined in your life? Right? And you get them to start going through it, and you're like, okay, so where else is it? Like, is it here? Is it here? Because how you do anything is how you do everything. And so the point of it is, if you want to build up to a big picture of your diet and nutrition, and that's where you want to be, or exercise, and that's where the big thing you want to become more disciplined in, you can't start there. You need to figure out where else in your life are all the small things you're not disciplined in. And you need to start working on becoming more disciplined on that, so it builds up so you can take a bigger chunk, bigger bite of the big thing. But the problem is that people try and start with the big thing without realizing there's all of this compound stuff going on. They're so unconsciously incompetent for all of this stuff in the rest of their life where they don't have discipline. And so coming back to what you've been talking about, which I think is really important, it's about, you have to keep being disciplined with everything you do. And it's not, and Jocko Willink's a big advocate, and I like this, is discipline equals freedom. And it's about going, by having the morning routine, that can vary, it doesn't have to be too strict, but having the fasting, whatever it is that you do, like compound those disciplines. So when something big comes in front of you that you do need to apply yourself to, or you need to challenge, it's less friction, right? It becomes easier to be able to accomplish it because you're already compounding discipline. And if you can become cognizant enough and become consciously competent in identifying the constrictions and where in your life aren't you being disciplined, become more disciplined in those areas, it helps everything else become easier. And you just see it all the time. And the final thing I just wanted to make a note on, just because we were talking about it, things being natural have become this weird gateway between cause and effect, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say you've got, I don't know, a fungal problem on your foot. You could go and get a steroid cream for that. I don't know what you take for, you'd be able to tell me better, but let's just say, argument's sake, for that. Someone else will go and get a like natural turmeric paste and put that on their foot, right? If that athlete's foot, whatever it is being caused because of, you know, poor footwear, poor foot hygiene, all the rest of it, what people don't realise is that using the turmeric paste is the same as putting the steroid cream on, right? It's still palliative, right? But they think because one's natural, then it's okay. And what I think is we get seduced in our world by doing this without actually taking the step and the responsibility to look at what's causing these things and actually going, what is it that's your problem here? And going back to that whole thing you were talking about with the planks and the things, it's going to going, oh, great, I can do that because it's not, I can lower my blood pressure without taking the pill. So I don't have to take the medication. I just got to do the plank and the wall sit. And you're kind of going, well, no, that's just become your new medication. Because the idea is that if you stop doing those things, does your blood pressure go back up again? And you go, so have you really solved the issue? And like going back to your point, which why I wanted to, when you said it, I really wanted to touch on this, which is like, is anyone talking about people's metabolic health? Are people talking about people's diets? Are people talking about those other things? Or has the pill been replaced with a new pill, but the pill is now the prescription of planking and wall sitting?
It's a great point you made. Like, and I think, I mean, I had a patient came in Tuesday night for some new antidepressant medication, and came in and I just sort of talked them through the medication, and then I just sort of said, oh, just out of interest, what's your sort of overall health like? I mean, he was slightly overweight, but nothing, you know, wouldn't sort of say he was 2.2 overweight. Sorry. And I sort of said to him, so, you know, what else is going on? And I sort of said, you know, what's your bowels like? You know, what's your gut health like? And he sort of said, oh, you know, why are you asking me that? And I just sort of said, oh, you know, the link between the gut-brain axis, and we talked through that a bit more. And it was interesting the fact that he was having massive IBS problems, and he was having this probably about 3 or 4 months before the depression came on. And causation isn't correlation, but I was just sort of saying, then explaining how we were talking about the other day about LPS. So I said, you have tryptophan that comes in, that gets changed into serotonin, but in the same gut, if it's inflamed and not functioning properly and has high amounts of endotoxin in it, it can actually be turned into a neurotoxin or neuroirritant that can go up and cause depression and anxiety. And, you know, obviously leaky gut, we were talking about the effects of LPS on that, you know, blood sugar. The glucose goddess talks about how spikes in blood sugar can cause foggy headedness, depression, anxiety, low mood, low energy. So you stack all these things together, and he was like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of doing everything. And what him walking out with that one medication had thought, and I think what it also does is taking something or getting something, which is rich from a pharmacist, but what it almost does is it takes away the ownership of you to do something about it.
Yeah.
Because you go, well, I'm going to take this, and this thing here is going to make me feel better. But it's like, what are you going to do about it on top?
And also, I think there's on the other side of it, which I think is that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So a lot of people feel like taking the medication is them taking that control,
and,
right?
And no, you're right. And it is, you know, the bravery to go and speak to that person. And I'm not sort of discounting that at all. But I think what from a point, so this is a classic, right? I went to see you, get my back treated, treated my back, and it was absolutely amazing. 4 days later, it came back and it was really horrifically painful. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, this is just so sore again. And then I looked at the message you sent me, aftercare stretching, and I thought, oh, I'm never going to do them. And I thought, I have to do them because I'm in so much pain. Did the aftercare stretching, it went.
Yeah.
So the fact that I went to you and I was like, Josh is just going to fix me. Yeah. And you basically fixed me by about 90%. And that 10%, I was like, oh, it's there again. Oh, it's there again. And I thought, I'm going to have to go back. And then I was like, no. Take responsibility. He had sent you some aftercare to do and you haven't done it. And I did it. And I thought to myself, crikey, it just makes you...
I think you've summed up, and maybe this is where we can wrap up or sum up, but I think you've just summed up something really beautiful there, which is that I, in that situation, became the pill, right?
Yeah.
Within an hour, was able to give you 90% relief of your symptoms. Perfect. I think what we're talking about is like, you can go away with that antidepressant pill, right? But don't disregard, and that might give you the 90% relief that you're looking for in your symptoms, but don't disregard the 10.
Yeah.
Right. And the 10 is what we talk about. And hopefully for a lot of people, the pill is the 10 and the 90 is what we're talking about. But, it weights differently for everyone. But it's my understanding it's kind of going, well, actually, with taking that pill, it's great. But also, I would make sure we're looking at these other factors because they will contribute. And if you don't want to keep taking these things, and we see that, don't we? And you probably, I'm kind of talking about your particular expertise here, but there people do become disillusioned with medication after a long period of time, in as much that everyone after a certain period of time goes, I want to sort this out because I no longer want to be taking my medication, right? Yeah. After a long period of time, people realize, a lot of people say, I don't want to be taking this anymore. And so I just think if we can it's fine taking those things, but if we can also get people to be doing some of the other healthier things around it, such as getting the grounding, getting the morning sunlight, getting the fasting in, getting the cold exposure, make sure you've got, your electrolytes and all the different things, hydration, all the things we talk about. Great. Keep doing that, but just don't disregard the other stuff just because you're taking the thing or doing the plank or whatever it is. I'm an advocate of planks, by the way, and wall sits. They're good. They're good for the lower back. But yeah, anyway.
No, that's good. No, I think it's a good place to end. So thank you so much for joining us for episode 7. Can't believe it's episode 7. Right?
Yeah, I know.
So thank you so much. Please go and look in the show notes. We've got our Instagram, Facebook, and we also have our 28-day intermittent fasting challenge that comes with a free ebook. So we'd love you to go and check that out. Please share our content. Please pass it on to anyone you think might benefit from it. And also, please like and subscribe to wherever you're listening to. It really makes a massive difference.